Welcome back. Sam Seder, Majority Report on the phone. Pleasure to welcome to the program environmental attorney Barbara Freese. She is the author of Industrial Strength Denial, 8 Stories of Corporations Defending the Indefensible, from the Slave Trade to Climate Change. Barbara, welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks for having me.
All right. So I want to just start with, I guess, what was sort of the beginning of your road of this journey that you have taken through writing your first book about coal, but into the machinations that allowed coal executives, and then ultimately you looked into 7 other industries to do what they do. I think folks who are longtime listeners know that I go twice a year to a mass tort conference where I interview all sorts of tort attorneys. And I ask them the question that I think you have answered, at least to the extent that one can in your book, which is like, how do these people justify making these decisions? After you hear that, what emails were found in discovery or whatnot. But first, tell us about that cross-examination that you had of coal industry executives back, I guess it was in the late 90s. You were working for, I think it was the state of Minnesota, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
And just give us the context of that, because, and also even the change in legislation, the statutory change that changed how you calculated, what coal was, whether, what the standards for the use of coal were.
Right, sure. So yeah, I was an assistant attorney general for the state of Minnesota, which meant that I was basically a line attorney working for the state and representing our pollution control agency. Minnesota had passed a law that that required our public utility regulators to try to calculate in dollars the cost to the environment of generating electricity. So this was really just intended to be some information that would help with energy planning, because of course, public utility regulators play a big role in deciding whether utilities should be investing money in coal plants or other forms of electricity. So this was an early attempt to try to get at that issue and to do it in a science-based way. And it led to this enormous proceeding in the state of Minnesota. This was actually 1995, I think, when we had the hearings. And all the utilities in the state were parties, and we looked at all of the different pollutants coming from coal plants, including CO2 and climate change. And this was still relatively early for states to be getting involved in that issue from a policy perspective, and it really did freak out the coal industry. And they sent many witnesses to testify, and these were scientists, actually, the ones that I cross-examined, not executives, although the executives were obviously supporting their testimony. And they came to essentially tell us in Minnesota that even though the world had already entered into a global treaty to try to fight climate change, and that there was already enormous evidence that this was a genuine threat, they basically came to tell us that we really did not need to worry about it, that it wasn't going to happen, or if it did happen, it would be mild and we'd enjoy it because we're a cold state. And that all those other scientists who were, on whose work the world was mobilizing at that point, that they were basically biased, and we should discount their views. And so that was pretty shocking. And it led me to, among other things, write my first book, Coal, A Human History, which was sparked in part by that. And then over the years, I did additional work trying to prevent the construction of new coal plants, trying to get in place climate laws, worked for the Union of Concerned Scientists, and in the context of this ended up facing a lot more climate denial, and saw it sort of spreading through history, or rather spreading through society. But like you, my initial question in the mid-90s kept recurring, which was, how can they be saying these things when there is so much evidence and so much danger? And I started thinking of this as a social phenomenon, which shouldn't be a big surprise to anyone. But once you really start thinking of it that way, rather than what's wrong with this individual? Then you start to ask, well, where else has this phenomenon taken society in the past? And how precisely did industries actually justify what they were doing and when confronted with this really compelling evidence? And how did societies overcome that if they did? And so that was what prompted me to start really digging through the archives.
Okay, so now there's a lot of stuff here, and so that I want to go through, but let's and because when we talk about it as a social phenomenon, right, we're talking about it as a social phenomenon within the context of corporations, as a society in and of itself, and then also a social phenomenon in a broader context, and certainly we see that at the very least. We see it with, particularly when it comes to global warming, right? Because that is sort of like the denial, sort of, I don't know if it, I don't know that it escaped the bottle. I think it was, it was sort of like poured on society as part of a tactic in some way. And so I want to just stay for a moment in terms of tactics, because, which is maybe it's, I know that the tobacco industry and the fossil fuel energy, or I should say the fossil fuel industry, has borrowed a lot of tactics that were developed by the tobacco industry. That that denial is almost like is being a little bit generous, right? In the context of that, but the denial. Go ahead.
If you take the narrow psychological definition of denial, it's being generous, and I do try to use the term more broadly to include both what we might consider psychological denial and just straight up, from a legal perspective, denying that something exists.
Okay, so let's talk about let's just isolate for a moment, because one of the other industries you looked at was tobacco. Let's just talk about the sort of the similarities. How much of I imagine the denial takes place there, maybe, for these industry executives who are smoking cigarettes, as they're sitting in the boardroom. But then they basically try and manufacture a psychological denial for a greater community. What tactics did they use that were sort of like consciously adopted from the oil industry or fossil fuels from the tobacco industry? And has there been any other sort of like instances that you found where tactics sort of consciously were adopted?
Well, certainly one of the tactics that was adopted was the use of front groups. That was something that the tobacco industry did a lot, still does, trying to put their arguments into the mouths of other parties who would sound more credible. And certainly we saw that and continue to see that with the fossil fuel industry. By the way, my climate denial chapter is not just about coal, but about the whole fossil fuel industry and the various groups that they fund. Another enormously important tactic that they use is simply around the burden of proof. If you keep the burden of proof on those alleging danger, then by definition, the benefit of the doubt goes to those on the other side. It goes to the industry. And once you have the benefit of the doubt, you have a profound incentive to always exaggerate the doubt. And that's really easy to do. And when you do that, you essentially create enough confusion that allows you to block any government action. So that dynamic was clearly present with the tobacco companies, still is, and has certainly been used by the fossil fuel industry. Another thing we saw a lot with the tobacco companies was trying to exalt their own motives, so that instead of saying, we're here to sell a product and make a lot of money, they would cast themselves as essentially the defenders of freedom, often casting their opponents as fascists and sort of entering into this tribal mindset where they're the heroes, their opponents are absolutely the enemies. Excuse me, and the system is rigged against them. So that's certainly something we've seen the fossil fuel industry do as well. In the case of fossil fuel, ironically, instead of just saying that they're defending free enterprise, which many of the industries have done, they're arguing that they are defending Americans against the sinister elite. And that gets kind of strange because you end up with billionaires and oil companies funding arguments that are meant to persuade economically folks on the economically lower side of the scale to distrust those at the top by using this term elite. But of course, they're using it to disparage the mainstream scientists who are spending their lives studying this and really have the expertise.
I mean, this may be outside your portfolio, or maybe not, but I mean, everything you just said, particularly like in that description, I feel like could apply to, I don't know, 75% of the stories about, what's going on with coronavirus right now. And frankly, what's going on even with stuff like, the supposed free speech that, many on the right feel that they're being denied, like this dynamic of aggrievement and, whatever product they're selling. And just like, I'm just asking questions, right? Like I'm just putting doubt out there. I mean, what is what's downstream from what in that?
Well, I can tell you with climate change, I mean, it clearly, in terms of climate denial, that clearly began with the industry. And I was there in the 90s when they were really getting this cranked up and sent it out then through these front groups, through right-wing media, and then into the Republican Party, and then finally took it over. And that was a really dramatic change. But I mean, you're certainly right that these kinds of dynamics of denial and tribalism appear again and again in lots of different contexts. It's just that in the industrial context, in the corporate context, you have all of these factors that promote denial, plus you have this powerful financial incentive, and you've got this ideology that basically says that the invisible hand will make sure that if you pursue your self-interest, it will automatically lead to the public's interest, and then more recently, in its more extreme forms, that any government interference with the marketplace is inherently evil. So yeah, I mean, what we see in industrial strength denial is a lot of dynamics that seem particularly familiar right now as our nation is engaged in these very, very tribal conflicts over issues that often have a very clear scientific basis to them, or an emerging one in the case of COVID, because of course we're learning things very quickly.
I want to get into sort of like the broad methodologies, if you will, of denial and how they may be in the various industries that they manifest themselves in the various industries you looked at. But one thing that occurs to me is that, in terms of climate change, years ago, maybe it was about 10 years ago, I was on a panel with Christine Todd Whitman, who was the former EPA, I think under maybe it was George W. Bush. And
I think so.
And her response at one point, she said, if the left and the liberals, which is what they referred to the left at that time, if the liberals weren't so animated about pushing climate change, maybe folks on the right would be more responsive to it. Like that dynamic I just found fascinating, that there was almost it's the critics' fault that make it so hard for us to sort of lose our denial on some level. And I wonder if that, if that wasn't a dynamic that you came across in the course of looking at these things, that like maybe if people weren't so so overly worried about how much cancer they could get from cigarettes, we would be more willing to look at it, or something like that. I mean, is there anything like that you came across?
I don't think I can actually point to one. I mean, in the great panoply of different kinds of denials, that's kind of a unique one, and certainly not something that I think that the history of any of these campaigns of denial would support. On the contrary, the ability of the industry to remain complacent and denial and deny the harms they're causing seems to be almost endless. And it seems like the only way to get it to be confronted by society is for outsiders to raise the alarm and keep doing it.
I wonder though, as I say it now, if that isn't just a tribalism, a mechanism in which to enhance tribalism, and then the tribalism itself does the rest of the work. I mean, talk about tribalism in this context, because this is what you identify as a big driver of denial. How does tribalism manifest itself in the context of, like, I don't know, selling unsafe cars?
Well, it manifests itself in every one of these chapters, and that's in part because we have evolved minds that are so immediately divided into us versus them, even when there's really not much at stake. It just automatically happens, and neuroscientific research is showing how immediately it affects the way that we look at the world, in terms of both of deciding what we believe to be factually true, and certainly deciding what we believe to be morally correct. And so, generally speaking, the way tribalism unfolds is that you've got somebody outside an industry who is showing up with some evidence that this industry is causing harm. Now, the people within that industry are very automatically and by human nature going to get defensive, and especially if they're not feeling guilty, and they're probably not feeling guilty about it because they didn't intend to hurt anybody. And they will start immediately being suspicious that their critics have an ulterior motive beyond just addressing the issue. So they'll start accusing their critics of having that ulterior motive. Maybe they're greedy, maybe they just want attention, maybe they're zealots of some sinister cause. At the same time, they'll start elevating their own role in making the world a wonderful place beyond, just selling the product that they're selling. And before very long, if the public opinion starts changing against them, they will start to complain of a witch hunt, of lynching. They will claim the system is rigged. Once they start feeling that the world isn't fair to them, then that, of course, justifies all kinds of blatantly deceptive things like using front groups and whatnot. So I think that's the general pattern that plays out. In terms of the auto industry, they, of course, were, they were at the top of the world after World War II. They were, some of the biggest companies in the world. They the United States was really redesigning itself around automobiles. But there were so many crashes, so many people dying, and it was a very visible problem. The way they handled it was basically to say that it's to keep the focus not on the cause of the injury, but the cause of the accident. And the cause of the accident, they could almost always claim, was bad drivers, people with bad attitudes, maybe sometimes bad roads. So that was the government's problem. So a big shift there was to get people to start looking at what actually kills folks. Flying through the windshield, for example, or smashing into a dashboard with all kinds of sharp and pointy things on it. And when people from the outside tried to say, like doctors who would show up and say, see how this patient's facial gash accurately reflects this dashboard feature, you should change your dashboards. The auto industry was outraged. They didn't think those people had any business telling them how to design their cars. And of course, that became quite public when Ralph Nader came along and tried to suggest that there were certain ways to redesign their cars. They were just at the very top of the world, and they thought it was audacity for anybody from outside of their tribe to suggest that they were doing something wrong or had a responsibility to protect the drivers who inevitably crashed in millions of crashes, even if they were good drivers or even if they were bad drivers. They still didn't necessarily deserve to fly through their windshield.